Despite the fact that the Linux is used in many mission-critical applications, for example, Tokyo Stock Exchange is running on Linux. Many leading financial institutions in Japan are using Linux.
Right.
Still, many IT managers feel uneasiness of using open source software from a security point of view, from support point of view. And I wonder if you could give some messages to these
Sure.
managers who are still worrying about the open source software.
Sure. I mean, 10 years ago, we used to hear similar concerns in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I want to emphasize 10 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
we heard those concerns
Mm-hmm.
about security, about
Mm-hmm.
support,
Mm-hmm.
about performance,
Mm-hmm.
about you name it.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing that I would say is that oftentimes, being hesitant to use open source because of security or support is really a euphemism or another way to say, I just don't want to change,
Mm-hmm.
period.
Mm-hmm.
That just change itself
Yes.
is difficult.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's important to understand that Linux as a platform is incredibly secure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it has been proven. It's in nuclear submarines, air traffic control systems. It's on the Mars rover. It's in the International Space Station. It is in 85% of the world, literally, of the world's stock trading platforms. I mean, you mentioned the Tokyo Stock Exchange. Well, it runs the New York and the London Stock Exchange. It runs essentially the entire global economy. I mean, clearly, it is secure if it is used in these type of fashions.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to just having testimonial in terms of the mission critical nature of secure Linux deployments that I mentioned, a company called Coverity in the United States, which does code scanning for security, it publishes a report every year on major open source projects and proprietary software in terms of the number of security vulnerabilities that they find. And Linux is consistently number one.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm.
And I think the reason for that is because the transparency in the development process allows people to catch security bugs quickly, right? Most of the time a security flaw is bad programming, and you have so many people looking at the code that these security bugs are found very, very quickly in the case of Linux. I mean, in a proprietary software company, you don't even know, right? How do you check on whether or not there's a security flaw until your own system has already been compromised, and then you have to go ask for a security patch to remediate that situation. So certainly security is something that today people don't really consider a problem for open source or Linux. In terms of support, once again, there are dozens and dozens of organizations that provide enterprise support for Linux. Here in Japan, there's obviously Fujitsu, Hitachi, NEC provide top-notch support for a wide variety of open source software, but there are also smaller firms here in Japan who do that. In the United States, many companies just provide their own support. If you're Facebook or you're Google or you're Amazon, you don't need a third party. You support this all yourself. Open source is a core competency. But here's the final point I would make in terms of change and open source. And it's best illustrated by looking at cloud computing, right? Cloud computing is again, Amazon Web Services, it's based on Linux and Zen and a wide variety of open source software. NTT's cloud is based on OpenStack. For every dollar spent on Amazon's Web Services, $4 of traditional IT spend goes away. Nobody buys hardware, nobody buys software, it's all as a service. And so that change is already happening in the US based on open source software, based on providing software as a service. And whether or not that change happens in Japan I can assure you that it's already happening somewhere else and will come here soon. And so I think what you see is the best companies embracing open source, right, rather than fearing it, because open source, once again, as we initially talked about, is the only type of software, and Linux in particular, that sort of moves with the technology changes of the day. As we move from traditional in-house IT to IT as a service through cloud computing, Linux is and open source is the platform that moves in that direction at the same time. So I mean, what I find is that when people say, well, we don't want to use open source because it's not as secure or we can't get support, that the real issue is not open source. The real issue is change, period.
I see. I found out that one of the reasons why, as you said, about 94% of HPC supercomputer use Linux is that under Clinton administration in the United States, there was a, how do you call committee for the presidential committee?
Presidential committee.
Presidential committee, I cannot pronounce well, for HPC. At that time recommended that to maintain the competitiveness and also strengths of the United States in HPC domain, it was necessary to develop HPC software based on open source.
Right. And
one of the main reasons why they recommended was because of a security issue.
Right.
Because someone can counter-check the program and make sure that the software is safe enough. And in case of closed source, obviously, nobody knows what's in there.
Right.
So again, that I think is a good example of how open source can be quite secure.
Well, what's more interesting is the fact that that came from a government where the alternative software solutions are all U.S.-based companies.
I see.
Imagine if you're, Brazil or France or a country that, is depending on a company in another country, and you can't see the source code. So I mean, having access to the source code obviously allows you to control your own destiny, to check for any security vulnerabilities that are there. And the U.S. government is also helping in the transformation into cloud computing as well. They have a program called FedRAMP, which certifies public clouds like Amazon to host government computing services. So, and that's based on a set of security and availability criteria. And so you can see how, the U.S. government has been very progressive in terms of embracing these technology changes like open source and cloud computing.
FedRAMP, how do you spell?
FEDRAMP.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
And RAMP means where?
I don't know what the acronym's for, but it's part of the GSA government purchasing program in the United States.
I see. That's good.
Yeah.